Hello there, folks. I'm joined by the one and only Wayne Jasper, and we could go into a long conversation about his experience and decades in the fire service and some of his experience. But I'll throw it over to you, Wayne, to give us an idea of who is Wayne Jasper, what's your background, and then we'll get started on our leadership journey together. Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, I just started out as a volunteer, fell into the role accidentally when there just happened to be a house fire about 5 or 6 houses down from me, and ran down to help, and it was the middle of the night fire. By the time the thing was over with, I'd been recruited onto that department. This goes back into 1980, 1981, so did a few years as a volunteer firefighter, and then became a career firefighter with the Department of National Defense, a civilian firefighter at CFB Esquimalt, and put in 30 years there. Retired in 2016 and moved to the Okanagan to relax and enjoy the weather. I wasn't here very long, and accidentally found out that one of the departments here had bought one of my department's old trucks and was needing a little bit of help with it. So what turned out is a quick trip to go and help them run the truck ended up being recruited back onto a department. I'm now the deputy fire chief on that department with the Anarchist Mountain Volunteer Fire Department in Osoyoos, and I'm also a member of the Osoyoos Fire Department as well. So many years in, I'm about to complete my 35th year in the fire service in another couple months.
Well, so like a lot of people that we've been talking to, you're failing miserably at retirement. So good work
Yes.
on that one.
Yes.
Now, of particular interest to me, and probably a lot of people that are watching, is your background with regard to mental health and self-care. So can you give us a brief kind of synopsis of what that looks like? Because those will be some of the things that we'll unpack through our conversation here.
Well, like a lot of things that goes on in the fire service, you kind of find your way through what you're doing, and sometimes fall into a niche that you develop somewhat by accident. And having had some friends over the years that suffered from PTSD, I kind of sat down with them and started wondering, what is it we can do to help? We're seeing this a lot. It's obviously something that's been around for many, many years, long before I was even born. We're dating back to the World Wars when it was, they were referring to it as shell shock. And there's always been a pretty heavy stigma attached to it in the fire service and in any world there where people just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to admit that there's something going on, and they don't want to come out and ask for help. So I started working with a number of people that were going through it, and we started putting in the time to develop some programs, created a very useful program for departments called ADAPT to prevent PTSD. ADAPT is an acronym for Awareness, Dialogue, and Proactive Tracking. So the tracking is a very key issue because we've, in the fire service and like any other corporate service, seem to track things that are hazardous to your health or your business, and try to avoid that. So the fire service has continuously tracked hazardous exposures to various chemicals, asbestos, things like that, but they never tracked exposure to traumatic incidents. And one of the first keys in getting somebody some help is starting to realize that people are finding incidents that they're going to as traumatic, and starting to build up a pattern from attending these calls. So giving people now the opportunity to indicate right away after return from a call that it's they found it traumatic in nature, and just simple reporting, and they can either turn that in right away, or they can sit on their paperwork in their own locker and see if it goes away, and if not, they now have documented records to prove that they've attended some traumatic calls, and have built up that cumulative effect of it without having to be questioned relentlessly on what the calls were. They now have all the paperwork right there in their hand. So this has been something that we've been working on to spread all across, not only Canada, but trying to get people in North America. I know I've had some contact with members in Australia as well that are starting to implement this protocol, and it's it's turning out to be one of the key steps in breaking the stigma.
Now, because there's so much to unpack there, and recognizing that the private sector typically wouldn't have an accumulation of events. And I think we in the emergency services have
Well,
almost
you
done a
can only lose money
disservice.
so many times, so maybe
That
that can do it, right?
that's exactly it, not looking after the people, right? And so the kind of misperception or misconception is that critical incident stress is a single incident, when I think in both of our experience, well, it could be, but it's
Could be.
probably more insidious than that. So I'd be curious, as in crisis and in the private sector, for example, what would be an incident or something that would make somebody more prone in terms of the environment that they're going through? So what would make something a little bit more critical or more impactful for somebody than, say, examples that aren't, for example? So we've got a whole bunch of things to unpack there, but just so that we can help other people, kind of almost like a checklist, for lack of a better word, to see, oh, this is a situation that might be a little bit different, and I need to be even more aware of how I'm feeling and how those around us are feeling.
Well, one of the key things that can lead to this developing it into an issue is dealing with any incident, whether it's with the fire, or whether it's police, or whether it's EMS, or whether it's even out in the corporate world, where you're involved with something that can cause a fear of harm to yourself, where you're feeling you're harmed. You could be a bank teller being robbed. You could be somebody that's going through a divorce that's afraid to lose everything they've got. You could be a business that is starting to fold, and you're fearing for what you're going to do to look after your family, or how you're going to look after your employees that have been loyal to you for a while. It all comes down to a fear of something that you can't control, and something that's just going to continue to grow with you.
And so it was subtle, but very, very important, where we tend to think of safety as a physical safety, right? And I think a lot of people are like, no, I haven't been held up by a bank. I'm not at a bank. I'm not a firefighter. So this obviously doesn't pertain to me. But what does that look like in terms of the non-physical threats or those other fears that you talked about?
Well, it's also the mental aspect. When things are running smoothly for anybody, it's a pretty easygoing day. You don't build up the tensions inside and the stress because things haven't been going wrong. It goes quite well. You could be tasked with doing any kind of project that just is not going the way you're hoping it for it to do. It could be timelines on a construction project that you're not meeting because of supplies not coming in, and that you're the one in charge, that it's all fallen back on. Now you've got all those stresses that are starting to build on you, that start to put fear that you're not going to be able to overcome it. And you start internalize that initially, but eventually it can come outward, and there's just so many different things that can cause that stress.
And I think it's safe to say that it's hard to apply one blanket theme or statement across all, because I think in your experience, as is with mine, it's highly individualized. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, where I could have an experience that is the exact same as Wayne Jasper, and my interpretation of it, the meaning I attach to it, is completely different than yours. Would you agree?
Exactly. That's one of the things that is an example of a first emergency services type of call. We could be going to the exact same call, and it might not be that critical a call, but and we see this a lot in smaller communities, more so than the larger ones, where in a smaller community everybody knows everybody. And you could be going to a call, and it turns out to be that's your next door neighbor, or a friend that and the rest of the crew members might not have met them or might not have known them, but now all of a sudden that stress builds with you, because you're wondering, how are they going to look after their family now that they're hurt? We got to make sure that these people are getting the help that they need, and where the rest of the crew, they might not feel that same overwhelming stress from it, just simply by not knowing somebody. So Some people have the ability to basically internalize things and hang on to it. And this is where we get that cumulative buildup, where others, it can be a single incident. And it doesn't have to be a major incident. It could be a massive incident, or it could be, something so small as a car accident. As emergency responders, the one thing that sets us off before we even leave the station is when we hear a call that involves children. So, it doesn't matter whether you're EMS, police, or fire. As soon as you get a call along those lines, right away your stress is through the roof, your adrenaline's flowing, and they might not turn out to be a serious call, but you're affected before you even leave the station.
And recognizing that when you say community, that could very easily translate into corporation, large
Yes.
corporations, and all of these things may happen to somebody else, but in smaller organizations, we're also seeing the impact of these things. And I'm curious now, so if we were to go back and Wayne Jasper, the early leader, when you first got a stripe or two, where was mental wellness or stress management on your list of priorities? When you would go to a call, where was it back in the day?
To be honest with you, I don't think it was even there back in the day. It was just go and do your thing, and the only thing that was your concern was that everybody stayed safe and the crew stayed safe. But it's that same adage, when we're running into things while everybody else is running out, and there wasn't really that fear. There wasn't really that stress level for me in there. It might have been for some others, but it never really hit me until I started seeing it in others, and started recognizing that this was a real thing, and that we've got to change some of the things that we're doing, and we've got to do something to help those that are going through it.
And so let's fast forward a year or two, and now Wayne Jasper is sitting right here. What have you learned with regard to a leader's responsibility? So we'll start with the responsibility and then how they can carry it out. But from your perspective, what is the leader's responsibility with regard to self-care, taking care of the people? Because one thing that we often forget, and we were just speaking off camera, is from a business perspective, there's a tendency to focus on the bottom line and the business impact. But no matter if it's a fire service or bank, your job is to look after the people doing the job. So what kind of responsibilities in your mind does a leader have with regard to that?
I would say from my recent experiences that the most important thing right now is to recognize what you need to do yourself to help yourself first. You got to maintain your own ability to look after others, and a lot of times we're seeing that some of the leaders that were are being tasked with some pretty heavy duty jobs, they're not taking care of themselves, and this is when things start falling apart below them. Where if you've got to maintain your own physical ability, your mental ability, your cognitive coping skills. There's just so many things that you can do to start building your own resilience, which you can then pass on to those below you, and also getting to know what these issues are and what the common signs and symptoms are of when somebody is struggling with some of these tough issues. It leads well to being able to help them and to be able to, approach them in something that they might find not very comfortable to approach you about. So you've got to be able to, be very fair with people that are dealing with some issues, and you've got to understand that sometimes it's not their fault. It's what's happened to them, and it's not anything that they're controlling, because they're not understanding it themselves. So in order to build that resilience and learn about it is a very key thing for leaders on the upper level. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the fire service or the corporate world. You can't look after those below you if you're not looking after yourself.
I completely agree. So why don't leaders look after themselves? And I've got some ideas around it, and why, over my experience, I've been the last one. So why is that in your experience that leaders typically are the last ones to take care of themselves, when, to your point, that's a pretty critical component of any team functioning is the leadership of it? So why don't we take care of ourselves?
That's a tough one. I think it almost falls into a couple of different groups where you may be somebody that's been placed in that role and moved up maybe too soon, or you could be somebody that's just had that determination to go forward and fight everything, beat everything, change everything, do everything your way. That's just the way it is. And we have so many different personalities involved, and I think that if we might be more inclined to see it in those that have been moved into a position that may not quite have been ready for that position, and now we're putting stress on them to carry out a job that they maybe looked forward to down the road, but weren't quite prepared for it. So it's hard to say. Then we've got those that we've got people that are incredibly book smart. They can go through a book and pick everything out of it. Yet when you put them in place in the real world, it's sometimes difficult to apply what they've just learned. And there's just so many different combinations of what makes somebody a good leader. It's just not one thing, but recognizing what you're doing for others and recognizing what you're doing for yourself, or what you're not doing for yourself, and what's harming and harming what you're doing to yourself, you're ultimately harming those below you.
And I think it's often like a badge of honor that if the leader isn't walking around with his or her hair on fire, they're not doing their job, right? And I think that we should break that stigma as much as we can, because in my view, the leader should be the least frenetic, whether it be on scene or in the boardroom or whatever, because they need to set the tone. But if we get into this, hamster wheel of activity and this badge of honor, then we forget that, we're only human ourselves. And so I think one of the words that we could use with regard to the leader's responsibility, or what you can do, was kind of empathy. And can you speak to that? Because I think
definitely.
that's a word we didn't hear 10 years ago when we talked about leadership.
And you've got to be working in a position and in a way that you have to recognize you're working with whoever's working underneath you. Whether you're the leader or whether you're the guy in the mailroom, you're all working for the same common goal, and you've all got a specific task that you've got to do. And sometimes it takes a little bit to recognize when somebody's struggling, and to show them that extra hand up to get them going in the right direction and to get them through to the next level. So we really do need to have that empathy. It's hard. It can take a lot out of you too when you have a lot of empathy for somebody and you're trying to work with them and trying to be there for them to help them out and still look after yourself at the same time.
And so with regard to, the leader needs to walk the walk with regard to empathy, but would you also agree that, kind of the conversation we just had with regard to leadership, part of it is also demonstrating the fact that this is tough on you as well.
It's not an adversarial position. And that's where a lot of times we see that leadership comes across as an adversarial position with those that are underneath you, and that's the first key in there are going to be issues developing. So you have to work in a way that it's not an adversarial position. You have to have that open door. You have to be able to be out, mingling with your staff. You got to let them know that maybe you're at the top, but one day you were in their position, and things change over time. Obviously, principles change, policies change, but everybody has to work with that.